We shall never surrender.
One small step for man.
I have a dream. Ask not what your country can do for you.
What's the status quo of your favorite quote? Professor Buzzkill explains all on Quote or No Quote.
Yes, indeedy, Buzzkillers. It's your old professor here with your Quote or No Quote show for the week. You know, Harry Truman was generally known as one of the most plain and direct speaking of American presidents. So much so that he's often credited with coining the phrase, "the buck stops here." By the time Truman became president in 1945, passing the buck had long been American slang for passing the responsibility for something on to someone else, usually the next person up or down the chain of command in a certain group or organization. Originally, the phrase comes from using a buckhorn-handled knife as a marker in a game of poker. The buck would pass around the table to the person whose turn it was, that is, whose responsibility it was, to deal the next hand. But did Truman coin the phrase, "the buck stops here"? Nope, Buzzkillers, he didn't. But the origin of this quote has as much to do with Truman being from Missouri as anything else, and I'll get to that in a minute. Here's what happened. In early 1945, Fred Canfill, the U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Missouri and a personal friend of Truman's, happened to be visiting the Federal Reformatory in El Reno, Oklahoma, which was a place for young male offenders. Among other things, the El Reno Reformatory had various workshops and other facilities to teach the young inmates something useful for when they got out. Canfill saw a desk sign painted with the phrase, "the buck stops here," in one of the workshops, and he thought that President Truman would like to have such a sign, so he asked the reformatory warden if an identical sign could be made for the president. The young men in the reformatory workshop duly made the sign, and it was sent to Truman on October 2nd, 1945. The president was delighted with the gift, and he placed it on his desk in the Oval Office. You've seen pictures of it there, and he often referred to it in subsequent speeches. The most direct reference was in an address to the National War College in 1952. Unfortunately, Buzzkillers, we don't have good audio from that speech, but Truman said, and I'm quoting, "You know, it's easy for the Monday morning quarterback to say what the coach should have done after the game is over. But when the decision is up before you, and on my desk I have a motto which says the buck stops here, the decision has to be made." End quote. He also referred to the idea of the buck stops here in his farewell address to the nation upon leaving office in January 1953. And here he is saying exactly that.
The greatest part of the president's job is to make decisions, big ones and small ones, dozens of them almost every day. The papers may circulate around the government for a while, but they finally reach this desk. And then there's no place else for them to go. The president, whoever he is, has to decide. He can't pass the buck to anybody. No one else can do the deciding for him. That is his job.
But I said a few minutes ago that there's another side to the story, and that's because there's another side to that sign. The back of the sign says, "I'm from Missouri." And that Missouri reference may have been one of the reasons that Fred Canfill thought Truman would like the sign when he saw it at the reformatory. And this brings me to my final thought about the famous "buck stops here" sign and the "buck stops here" phrase. You know, Buzzkillers, famous quotes and mottos are often just shortened versions of longer and perhaps more meaningful sayings. The Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri refers to the "buck stops here" as the front of the sign and the "I'm from Missouri" as the back of the sign. But Buzzkill Institute researchers can find no evidence or record of who originally designed the sign or which side was supposed to be the front and which side was supposed to be the back. Most people think of the full saying as, "The buck stops here, I'm from Missouri." But I think the original saying on that sign might have been meant to be read the other way around. My suspicion is that the whole motto and phrase makes more logical sense and was originally intended to read, I'm from Missouri, the buck stops here. Almost as if they're saying, I'm from Missouri, and an implied and, the buck stops here. And I'm absolutely certain that Truman would have loved that initial emphasis on being from the Show Me State. So give him hell, Missouri, and tell him Professor Buzzkill told you to. Talk to you next week.
Epicast.